The room is dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke, and the damp, stale scent of 100 spilled pints. It's a working men's club, the kind where steel-toed boots scuff against worn wooden floors, where laughter and raised voices bounce off nicotine-stained walls. But tonight, there is no laughter, no banter, just a handful of senior detectives, their expressions grim, their backs hunched under the weight of something far heavier than the thick air around them. At the centre of it all sits George Oldfield. His body sags, his fingers steepled in front of him as he leans forward, elbows resting on a scuffed table. The tape recorder before him whirs softly, almost innocently, before clicking into place. Then,
"I'm Jack."
The voice crackles through the cheap speakers, low, mocking, taunting, a thick accent, unmistakable. The detectives exchange glances, a silent conversation passing between them. But Oldfield doesn't look up. He just stares at the recorder, the dull hum of the tape filling the silence between each sinister word.
"I see you are still having no luck catching me."
A vein throbs in Oldfield's temple. His eyes, sunken and ringed with dark circles, flicker with something between fury and exhaustion. He looks like a man who hasn't slept properly in years, and perhaps he hasn't. His once powerful frame has shrunk beneath his ill-fitting suit, the fabric loose around his shoulders. His skin is pale, almost grey under the dim light, and his jaw works silently, the muscle clenching, releasing, clenching again. The words on the tape continue, twisting the knife deeper.
"I have the greatest respect for you, George. Good Lord. You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started."
His lips press into a thin line. The room is silent but for the whir of the tape, the sound of men breathing heavily through their noses. No one dares speak. George Oldfield, Assistant Chief Constable, had built his reputation on methodical police work, on patience, on instinct. But instinct had failed him this time. And though the weight of the case had already begun to settle on his shoulders, pressing him further into his chair, into himself, he had no idea just how much heavier it was about to become. By the time George Oldfield got the call, the killings had already begun to cast a long, dark shadow over the north of England. It was 1977, and Oldfield, now 55 years old, was a seasoned detective, a man who had spent decades hunting criminals, piecing together fractured evidence and solving the kind of cases that kept lesser men awake at night. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for what was waiting in the streets of Yorkshire. The Yorkshire Ripper had already struck at least 5 times, 5 women brutally murdered, their bodies left in the cold in different streets of Leeds and Bradford. The newspapers were filled with fear, the headlines screaming of a sadistic serial killer stalking the night. The pressure on the police was mounting, and the public was losing faith. Someone had to take control, someone with experience, someone who could bring order to the chaos. He wasn't new to high-profile cases. He had built his reputation tracking down Donald Nielsen, the so-called Black Panther, a ruthless burglar and kidnapper whose reign of terror had gripped the nation a few years earlier. Oldfield had hunted him down, and in doing so, cemented himself as one of Britain's most formidable detectives. But this case, this shadowy, elusive killer, would be different. It would test him in ways he had never imagined. So when the call came, he didn't hesitate. This was his case now. From the moment he took command, Oldfield threw himself into the investigation. Long hours, little sleep, endless meetings. His team scoured the crime scenes, reviewed statements, and chased leads that led nowhere. But the killer, whoever he was, stayed one step ahead. And in the weeks and months to come, the case wouldn't just consume his time, it would consume him. In the early summer of 1979, a tape arrived like a bolt of lightning into the heart of an investigation already teetering on the brink. 2 years since George Oldfield had taken charge, and still the Yorkshire Ripper remained a ghost, stalking, striking, and vanishing before the police could lay a hand on him. 10 women are dead now. The press circled like vultures. The public was terrified. And Oldfield? Oldfield was drowning. His face had grown gaunt, his skin taking on a greyish pallor under the relentless fluorescent lights of the incident room. The weight of the case pressed down on him like an anvil. And now, here in front of him, sat something new. A breakthrough? A cruel trick? A warning? It was a cassette tape, postmarked from Sunderland. No fingerprints, no clues, just a voice, low, mocking, thick, with a Wearside accent. He pressed play. The voice slithered through the cheap police speakers, calm, unhurried, full of malice. It was personal, deliberate, a direct challenge. Oldfield sat back in his chair, staring at the tape recorder, as if the machine itself had betrayed him. He wanted to believe this was real. He had to believe it. A voice, an accent, a place. Wearside. After years of chasing shadows, here was something tangible. A way forward. The experts were brought in. Linguists, voice analysts. They all agreed this man was from Sunderland or its surrounding districts. Oldfield seized on it, convinced the net was finally tightening. He made the call. All resources were to be redirected. The hunt was moving north. Posters were printed. Recordings of the voice were played over and over on the radio. Thousands of man-hours were poured into finding Wearside Jack. And yet, across the Pennines, the real killer, the man Oldfield had been hunting for years, was listening too. And he must have smiled. The hunt for the Wearside Ripper became an obsession for George. For 2 years, Oldfield and his team poured everything they had into tracking down the man behind that voice. £1 million spent, millions of posters printed, hundreds of thousands of police hours burned. Officers knocked on doors across Sunderland, Durham and Newcastle, chasing accents, hunting ghosts. Employers were asked to listen to the tape, to recognise the voice of a colleague. Convoys of police cars roamed the streets, stopping anyone who spoke with even the faintest hint of a Wearside drawl. But still, the murders continued. Women were dying, brutally, the same method, the same hammer blows, the same horror, but not in Sunderland, not in the northeast at all. While the police force was chasing a phantom, the real killer, Peter Sutcliffe, was still at work, slipping through their fingers again and again. 11, 12, 13. The bodies kept brutally appearing, but George Oldfield wouldn't let go. He was convinced. The voice was real. That man on the tape, the one taunting him by name, had to be the one they were looking for. The entire force was pushed to breaking point. Officers who had doubted the tape were overruled, moved on. Witnesses who had been attacked described the suspect as a Yorkshireman with a Yorkshire accent were ignored. And George? George Oldfield was falling apart. The late nights turned into early mornings. The cigarettes became chain-smoked, burned down to the filter before another one was lit. The booze became a crutch, the only thing numbing the failure clawing at his insides. The strain was killing him. Then, in 1980, he suffered a massive heart attack. It should have been a warning, a sign to step back, to breathe. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with the world watching. Then the phone call. It came into a confidential police helpline. An anonymous voice, quiet, almost embarrassed. "It's a hoax." The officer on the end of the line, having heard the voice on the tape hundreds of times, recognised it instantly. Wearside Jack wasn't the Ripper. He never had been. 2 years, 2 whole years lost, a fortune wasted, a police force led down a blind alley, 3 women murdered while the real monster was standing right in front of them, and for George Oldfield, it was over. The case was slipping from his fingers. His health was in ruins. The weight of failure was unbearable, and still the killer was out there. For 5 years, Peter Sutcliffe had stalked the streets of the north of England, leaving behind a trail of murder and terror. Despite a massive police investigation, countless witness statements, and multiple interviews, he had walked free every single time. It wasn't the West Yorkshire Police force who finally stopped him. It wasn't a carefully laid trap or a breakthrough in forensic science. It was something far simpler. A traffic stop. It was a cold January night in 1981. Two officers from South Yorkshire Police, Constable Robert Hydes and Sergeant Bob Ring, were patrolling in Sheffield's red light district. They spotted a brown Rover saloon parked on Melbourne Avenue, its driver and female passenger looking suspicious. The officers approached. Sutcliffe was behind the wheel, and beside him sat Olivia Reevers, a 24-year-old known sex worker. Something didn't sit right. Sutcliffe gave a false name, Peter Williams, and claimed the car belonged to a friend. A quick check with dispatch proved that was a lie. The plates were false. It was enough to bring him in for questioning. But before they left, Sutcliffe made one simple request. "Can I go have a pee?" The officers agreed. They pointed him to a low wall and turned their backs for a moment. It was all he needed. In the darkness he reached into his pocket, pulled out a hammer and a knife, and silently tossed them over the wall. With the weapons gone, Peter Sutcliffe thought he was safe. At the station, it should have been routine. Another small-time offence, a night in a cell, and back out the next day. But then something happened. As the officers processed his details, one detective took a closer look at Sutcliffe's face. The beard, the dark, heavy-set eyes, the slightly gaunt cheeks. It looked familiar. For years, West Yorkshire Police had issued photo-fit sketches of the Ripper all over England, based on witness descriptions. And now, staring back at them in the station, was a man who looked uncannily similar to the posters that were displayed on their walls. Something told them to dig deeper. While Sutcliffe sat in custody, officers returned to the scene of his arrest. The car, the pavement, the low wall where he had stopped to relieve himself. And there, lying in the dirt just beyond the wall, they found them. A hammer and a knife. This wasn't just a man out for sex. This was their man. The Yorkshire Ripper had finally been caught. The truth was staggering. Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed by West Yorkshire Police 9 times. His name had been on their suspect list for years. Witnesses had described a Yorkshire accent, yet Oldfield and his team dismissed any leads that didn't fit the hoax tape from Wearside. They had stopped him in red light districts, questioned him about his movements, even interviewed his wife. But every time, he had walked free. Why? Because they had been chasing the wrong voice. Because they ignored evidence that didn't match their theory. Because they believed the hoax over their own witnesses. And because, in the end, it wasn't West Yorkshire's Ripper squad who found him. It was 2 ordinary policemen from South Yorkshire on a routine patrol, stopping a man who just didn't look right. The biggest manhunt in British history ended in sheer luck. For 6 years, George Oldfield had carried the weight of Britain's most infamous manhunt. It had consumed him, every waking moment, every sleepless night. The Yorkshire Ripper case wasn't just another investigation. It was an obsession, and in the end, it killed him. By 1980, the toll was already visible. He was once one of the finest detectives in Britain, a man known for his sharp instincts and relentless drive. But now he was a shadow of himself. His posture had changed, shoulders slumped under the burden of failure. His eyes, once sharp, now carried a distant, haunted look. The lines on his face are deeper, harsher, carved by exhaustion, stress and regret. The Wearside hoax had drained him. His blind belief in that mocking, taunting voice had cost lives. While he sent his officers chasing ghosts in Sunderland, Peter Sutcliffe was still killing. 3 more women died while they followed the wrong trail, and by the time the truth was clear, Oldfield's health was in ruins. His first heart attack had come before Sutcliffe was even caught, a year before the Ripper was finally arrested. He returned to work briefly, but it was clear he was never the same. By 1982, just 1 year after Sutcliffe's capture, he was forced into retirement, his body too weak, his mind too worn down to continue. Then, in July 1985, George Oldfield suffered his final fatal heart attack. He died at his home in Leeds, aged just 61, 4 years after the Yorkshire Ripper was put behind bars. For many, he was known as the great detective who failed. The man who let a hoaxer lead him astray, the officer who missed Sutcliffe even when he was right in front of him. But for those who worked with him, there was another title, a darker one, the 14th victim. Because while Sutcliffe's final official body count stood at 13 murdered women, those who knew Oldfield, who saw what that case did to him, believed the real number was one higher. Peter Sutcliffe didn't just kill prostitutes and shop assistants, students and mothers. He killed a policeman too.